All right, gang. Today I want to talk about some Southern California killer places to train, at least back in the day, probably still to this day, at least Muscle Beach. But at Muscle Beach and a place called the Dungeon. And a lot of big time guys trained at both places. And I had the privilege of getting to know two guys who trained at both places back in their heyday. One was Joe DeMarco from the Culver City Club, and the other was Sam Calhoun, who became a friend of mine, and we kind of became pen pals. And he sent me pictures of back when he was in his heyday, back in the late 50s, early 60s, and of Muscle Beach, and he drew little maps of the area and stuff like that. Really cool guy. Unfortunately, passed away a little while back, as did Joe DeMarco, unfortunately. But Southern California, back in those days especially, was like the mecca of golden era bodybuilding. And there was a bunch of gyms around there, and I wrote my book, Great Men, Great Gyms of the Golden Age, focused on those gyms. And Muscle Beach and the Dungeon. Of course, Muscle Beach is technically a gym, but it was one of those places where all these guys trained. So you're going to see through here, and they did a movie about Muscle Beach, which you see this advertisement for. With Annette Funicello and the guy from Mission Impossible, who you'll see a picture of here later, had pretty good physique himself, and a bunch of people that were just big time bodybuilders and stuff back in those days. Larry Scott was in it. You'll see pictures of him in there. Dave Draper trained at the Dungeon, and I even talked about it in his book about training there. A bunch of old school professional wrestlers trained there. Pretty cool place, and it was owned by Vic Tanny, who you'll see pictures of down here. And there was a lot of the old Muscle Builder and Power magazines from Joe Weider will have articles, and you'll see some clips from the magazine, some covers from the magazine. My friend Sam made the cover one year at least, and it was he wrote a training article about Chuck Colris in there. I didn't put that in here just because it was almost too much, and all that stuff is in my book though. Chuck Colris was actually Sam's roommate for a while, which is pretty cool. And it just so happens that Chuck also trained with the Culver City guys, and he also trained at Zoover's, which is a whole other really awesome place that I have a chapter dedicated to in this same book. So I was very fortunate in getting to know Sam and getting to know Joe DeMarco, and between all the guys that they knew, powerlifters, Olympic lifters, Ike Berger. Ike Berger was another friend of Sam's and of Joe's. So it was kind of in Southern California. It was a small world back in those days, because you might find the same folks training at Gold's Gym, Vince Gironda's gym, also in the book. The Dungeon, Muscle Beach, Zoovers, and Bill Pearl's gym, and a few other places. Everybody kind of got to know each other, and took turns training at different places and stuff like that. So it was a really cool atmosphere. George Eiferman, another friend of Sam's, and I think also Joe DeMarco knew him. Really cool, nice guy, good bodybuilder. He's actually a Philly guy. And it just so happens that he went to high school in the same high school that my sister went to, Almy High School in Philly. And I would have gone there had I not, my parents not decided to send me to a Christian school, because that school in that area was getting a little rough at the time. But that's just an interesting little tidbit there for you. So Doug had all these really cool, and Sam had all these cool friends, Doug Stroll, who you see pictures of, and Reg Lewis. Reg Lewis was one of the guys that was would hang out with Mae West, and she would say, "Come up and see me sometime," and that kind of stuff. So just some really cool history that and great pictures and stuff that Sam was really kind enough to send me. He was he was a really awesome guy. There you see Zabo. Everybody knows who Zabo was. He was like Mr. Abs. Here's some other guys that Sam was friends with. He knew Hugo Labra, who he said was a really nice guy, very strong guy too, who also trained at the dungeon. Steve Reeves trained at the dungeon, and you'll see a shot of him doing like a hack squat, and you'll see Vic Tanny, who's the owner, in the background. Vic Tanny's son, Vic Tanny Jr., also made the cover of the Muscle Builder magazine, and he was quite a bodybuilder at the time. Also, Ellington Darden, who you'll see here some shots of. And it's interesting because Elle eventually ended up going to Florida and working for Art Jones, who I just posted a video about Casey Viator training for the Mr. America with Art. Ellington Darden was there. He actually worked for Art Jones, but he also was at Muscle Beach and knew about the dungeon, talked about the dungeon and other hardcore gyms. There's Reg Lewis on the cover of Muscle Builder. Gene Myers, that was another friend, and he was another cover man on Muscle Builder. He was another friend to Sam's. There's George Eiferman, quite a physique for in the 50s. We could talk about whether he was taking anything or not. That's a whole other story. I don't have any proof one way or the other, but it did exist even as early as the 50s. There's Marvin Eder and Artie Zeller. Artie Zeller was a photographer, and he has a really cool book, West Coast Bodybuilding, that has a lot of the stuff from Muscle Beach and the dungeon and all these other places. There's Vic Tanny in his jumpsuit, a little more casual look. But he had a whole string of like higher end gyms, which you see him at one of here in his suit and tie. But he, like I said, he was the owner of the dungeon and all these other gyms. Pretty cool guy. His brother Armand was a writer for Muscle Builder for a very long time. In fact, a lot of the articles that I have in my book about the Culver City Club were indeed penned by Armand Tanny. He was quite the bodybuilder himself, too. And I think there's even some shots in the video here where he's up on the stage. He lasted a long time. He lived into his 90s. So obviously he probably couldn't have been juicing too hard if he ended up living to his 90s. Marvin Eder was another guy. He was, he trained in New York and with Weeder and those guys. But like almost everybody else, eventually at some point, he went to go train in Southern California on the beach at the dungeon at that original Gold's Gym. That was another real mecca of powerlifting and mostly bodybuilding, but some powerlifters trained there too. Superstar Billy Graham trained there. Here's a guy from South Africa that was a big-time bodybuilder, and you can see he's pretty big on Muscle Beach back in those days. And this is just like a snippet of what you'll find in the book. And it's really relatively inexpensive. I think it's $20-25, so and a lot of pages, like 500 pages or more, with great pictures, great stories about all these guys, all these gyms. There's Chuck Sipes, who's one of my favorite old school guys, was worked with kids and stuff. Here's another friend of Sam's on the beach squatting. It was pretty cool to be out there, and you'll see Steve Marjanian, who was actually a close personal friend of DeMarco's. There's the Mission Impossible guy. And I think you'll recognize the other gentleman who was also in that Muscle Beach movie that we talked about and showed some pictures of earlier. There's a guy benching on the beach. You can imagine it. That had to be pretty cool. And I have other pictures in some of my other videos, and in my book about the Culver City Club. Incidentally, there's more Culver City stuff in this book as well. So if you haven't picked it up, I suggest you do, and it is available on Kindle as well if you don't want to get the hard copy book. The hard copy book is like a coffee table book, really nice to have. You can just sit there and thumb through the pictures, which is awesome in itself. So I'm going to sign off here. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll consider subscribing so you can stay tuned for what's next. Thanks, and I am out.